The reality is that as things grow and progress, there are these critical intangibles almost. You can't see them, you can't feel them physically, but they are the fabric of the business. The creativity, mental creativity of where we're going to take the practice, what we want to do, the impact we want to have, the environment we want to have, the support we want to give to one another, the culture we want to build. And all of that takes time and attention and nurture. And so it's easy to disregard that role and the time and energy that goes in. How do you put a value on your heart and soul? Welcome to the Scale My Clinic podcast. I'm Sachin, co-founder of Scale My Clinic, here to help general practice owners build thriving, profitable and efficient clinics. Together with Todd, we bring you actionable strategies, inspiring success stories and expert insights to transform your practice. Let's dive into today's episode and take the next step to improving your practice.
All right, hey, in today's session, we're going to have a bit of a run through of the 5 hats of business, something Sachin and I talk a lot about, and we talk with the people that we work in ownership. The first hat is that of the shareholder. The second hat is that of the technician, the GP. And then there's a role that's really probably more akin to a non-executive director type role. And then there's the executive director type role. And the last role of those is the creator role. Sachin, let's have a bit of a chat about each of those, pull them apart, maybe give some examples, and then talk about where people get stuck and it sometimes causes friction, particularly amongst owners. So how about we kick off with the shareholder position or role?
Yeah, shareholder, passive, don't do anything, chill out, just rake in the cash. That's the way it goes. All care, no responsibility, just rolling in the money.
Show me the money.
That's what shareholders about, right? If only. It might be how it appears to people outside, but it's far from that, the reality is. And I think, when you're talking, when you're talking about technicians, you could have been talking about all sorts of other hats. IT support, cleaner, chef, psychologist, all sorts of other hats that we have to wear. But I think with the shareholder, if we're talking ideal, is that what we're talking in an ideal world?
Yeah, well, I don't remember the last time ANZ called me up because I bought shares and said, hey, listen, Todd, we're a little bit short on Saturday morning down the local branch. We'd like you to come in and knock over a few hours at the front desk, if that's okay.
Yeah, you reminded me, actually. I remember early in my days of ownership getting a call on the Saturday morning on the doctors that was on. I was in my PJs at home, 7 minutes away. And this doctor calls and says, who's on reception this morning? I said, okay. They didn't call the manager, they called me. And that person had obviously forgotten. I went in my pajamas, opened the practice, switched on the computers. Thankfully, receptionist walked in at that stage. So there are some strange things you end up doing as an owner. But yeah, as a shareholder, ideally, that is a passive role in that you've made an investment, you hold shares in the business. Your shares receive a regular dividend and grow in value as the business grows and appreciates over time. And those shares, if the business is run well, or even if it's not run that well, but exists and is sustainable, then it's actually significantly healthier than an average investment in a listed business, because you're typically talking about 20, 30, 40% return on investment year by year. And so when a business is run well that you have an unfair advantage in, like general practice, if you're a general practitioner or someone who's got a background in health, then you've really got an advantage there as a shareholder. If you are truly a shareholder and that hat is specifically only the hat as a shareholder, but typically that's not the case, right? We've normally got all these other hats and you're sort of juggling while putting different ones on, and it can get quite tiresome.
Well, let's talk about something that most people are going to be a lot more familiar with, the hat of the technician. And we're not going to talk about IT, being under the desk, pulling cables out, rebooting printers and fixing paper jams. Let's just focus and pretend this is just the role of the GP. There's a couple of sub-roles in here that you might end up kind of having thrown at you as an owner. Things like supervising a GP registrar, potentially looking after medical students, some other roles that kind of might be built in there, medical director type roles, quality control, all those kind of things. Talk a bit about the role of the technician, Sachin.
Yeah, so obviously as a GP, we're seeing patients. If you're a GP technician, you may be an admin technician who owns the practice, right? So then you may be doing a management role or some other leadership role in the business. But, presuming you're a GP owning a practice, then the role of the clinician, so technician as a clinician, the GP, I like to think of that, the best way that's to be set up is in the same arrangement as any other doctor in your practice. And so it's sort of separated from the ownership wherever possible, and that there's a commercial standard arrangement between yourself and your business entity, so that really it helps facilitates replacement later. It's also, and maybe we'll talk about this in another episode, it also prevents that sort of unhealthy inflation of profit, giving you a false sense of security about the business. And so having a traditional arrangement like an arm's length proper relationship where you pay a standard service fee, or maybe something that's acceptable for the tax office but still a service fee to the practice, just means that the business can be truly assessed as a business because it's only receiving the income that it would normally receive if you were the same as any other GP. So that's obviously the main hat as a revenue generating GP. But then there's some other hats, for example, as a clinical supervisor, clinical lead, clinical governance. There's all sorts of other sub hats, if that's such a thing, that go beyond just that hat of the clinician. But they do all need to be recognised. Typically, those other ones are often unremunerated.
Yeah.
And so the problem there is, if it's not accounted for somewhere, then you get into a situation where you don't have the funds accounted for to replace yourself in that role. So that's one thing. And the second that can often lead to a bit of resentment is you can have situations where different owners, where there's multiple GP owners, may have different responsibilities or clinical workloads for whatever reason, because of personal choice, personal circumstances. And you can start to get some resentment that builds because those other hats are not recognised. And, often another area that you can get a bit of resentment is where there's two or three or four multiple clinical owners, GP owners, who all work different amounts or generate different amounts of billings.
Yeah.
And then you get into all sorts of weird, strange arrangements around how much each one contributes and how much of the costs are apportioned to each. It just gets, for me, it's too complicated. I like simplicity. You know me, I'm a very simple person. And so for simplicity, running it as from that particular hat, the revenue generated, your proportion that is a service fee goes to the practice entity, and then that should be the end of it. If you're having those sub hats, then that should be accounted for. Whether you actually as a business decide to pay yourself for that or not, there's a whole other question, but that needs to be accounted for so that you can replace that role as you grow.
100%. I think my preference with this, Sachin, is that there's, as we've talked about, is that there's kind of a foundational service and facility agreement or an employment agreement, if that's right. And then those extra responsibilities are kind of layered agreements. So if you're a medical director, that's an agreement that sits on top. If you are a GP registrar supervisor, that sits on top, medical student, educator, then all of those things can be removed or added one by one without affecting the base agreement. And we kind of see two things in the base agreements, like you were alluding to, Sachin. People either overpay or underpay themselves, and they underpay themselves to kind of put money into the business or retain money in the business, sometimes for nefarious purposes, but other times just to give the money to the business that it requires. And then the other one is that they over reward their role in that they may have a much higher retention than the regular GPs. And so that creates a lot of messiness at the time that they go to exit or when they're getting other doctors in. And I've certainly had doctors talk about how much their ownership is worth as purely a percentage of the billings that they get to retain. It's a little bit confusing for all. And so, as you said, I think people should engage the same as every other doctor in the team. That way their contribution there is the same, and those other sub roles, or maybe the little fascinators, like a little highlight on the hat, those things should be rewarded in different ways. All right, I think we've done the technician thing well. How about we jump to the non-executive director type stuff, visionary culture, those types of things, Sachin? How do you see that?
Yeah, I think that's sort of fundamental. Often, especially if you've started a greenfield, then it was all consuming at the beginning. As a greenfield site, you would have been over, anyone who's done it will know, you are literally doing anything and everything to get that first practice moving, build it from the ground or from a shell. And so you may be out and about purchasing secondhand furniture or any furniture you can get your hands on, all the way through to constant huddles with your team, because sometimes when you start, you may not have the resources or decide to invest in a practice manager early on. People often will cobble together what they can to get going. And there's no shame in that. Minimum viable product to get going is definitely a thing that I think we both talk about and support. But the reality is that as things grow and progress, there are these critical intangibles almost, in that you can't see them, you can't feel them physically, but they are the fabric of the business. The creativity, mental creativity of where we're going to take the practice, what we want to do, the impact we want to have, the environment we want to have, the support we want to give to one another, the culture we want to build. And all of that takes time and attention and nurture. And so it's easy to disregard that role and the time and energy that goes in. How do you put a value on your heart and soul?
Yeah, I think there's two foundational elements to it, right? You talked about one of them, which is the directional accuracy, just making sure that people have a vision big enough that they're willing to enroll in the journey. That's really important. And the other ones are really around giving a shit, just a bit of gas, and making sure that you show up in the right way, that you present at the workplace. It's very hard for other people to have higher standards than the leader, and hard for anybody else to care more about the mission than the leader. So if you don't do those things well, then that's going to have a fairly substantial impact on the business. And a willingness to show up in your pajamas, if required, is important. So I'll ask you later on, it's probably not appropriate for the episode to ask, did you have little fluffy bunnies on your feet, or... Don't answer that. All right, let's move to the next role, the executive role, where here you're kind of going to have something that is probably a job description or an accountability box, or if people use an org chart, like a position description, there's some kind of a role that's in the organization anyway, and you're going to be having people that you're accountable for that probably report to you. So there's some, we call it LMA, leadership management and accountability part of it. Maybe it's GP recruiting. It could be heading up occupational health or some other project that you're running potentially, or maybe it's an ongoing role. But talk about the executive role and what that means to you, Sachin, in a practice.
Yeah, I reckon you're being optimistic with the job description.
True.
Some will have that. And if you don't, and you're watching or listening to this, probably a good idea to go and write those things down.
Document, yeah.
And ideally, have things that you want to do only in that box, considering you're the boss. That would be my top tip. I think for a lot of people, they don't actually have that in all seriousness. Too busy to write it down, too busy to decide.
Yeah.
And so you have in that situation it's like a weird dichotomy. You're doing the stuff, you're doing it all, but then you're getting annoyed because some of it isn't getting done. Or others aren't doing it, but then you're taking it upon yourself to do it. And so I think what's really important here is getting really clear on what are those things that you love to do, that you are suitably and specially advantaged or specially placed to do,
mm-hmm.
and that are your unique skill set. And this is where diversity is really important, because when you have a group of owners, I remember years ago, early on in my business journey, I used to get annoyed with my business partner because they weren't doing what I was doing. Whereas actually, if I entered that business partnership now, I'd be really happy about that, because they were doing things that I didn't want to do or was no good at, and vice versa. But we would have been much more intentional about that. Now, when you've got a diverse leadership group or ownership group or executive group, you can divide and conquer the roles. Then you've got a couple of advantages. You can all work in your genius and your enjoyment. But then you've also are able to build single point accountability, which means that those things that you've been annoyed about, oh, bloody hell, that's not getting done, much more likely to get done because it's set up for that. This is the one, Todd, where I think that the biggest difficulty here is that this is most commonly completely non-remunerated.
Yeah.
Right? And normally leads to perverse incentives. So what happens typically is that people are incentivized for the clinical technician hat that we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
So maybe, like you were talking about, you get a disproportionately high
mm-hmm.
retention of your billings, or reduced service fee because you're an owner.
Mm-hmm.
So then your income generation is very tightly linked to your clinical work. Whereas you have a limited amount of time, and this executive function that we're talking about needs time and attention and focus. But if it's not remunerated, but the clinical work is, right, then you've got multiple things that will pull you away to the clinical work. The money, the guilt of, oh, there are patients that need to be seen, the appointment book's full. How many times in your ownership was it like 3 o'clock or 2 o'clock, the appointment books are full, and you're like, oh, you know, you get your super person cape on, right? Yeah. Guys, open up another hour. I'll just see a few extras. Right? You get incentivized perversely to do that. Not because of the money.
Yeah.
As an owner, your mindset is to want to help your community and make a difference. And so you, not only is the monetary incentive pointing you that way, your baseline emotional and behavioral traits point you to that way. And so you're creating a situation where, for many, it's an unwinnable game. And so the big caveat here is that the big thing that supports having a commercial standard arrangement with the practice from the clinical point of view is that then you don't have a perverse incentive to drag you away from one of the vital areas of work, which is your executive function in, not cognitive executive function, but your executive function in your practice, right? And so I think this is the one where you get the most disagreements, the most difficulty and personal pain, because it's the one that, even though you want to focus on it and typically you know you need to focus on it, it's the one where it feels like there's not enough time because the variety of reasons I just talked about, you're pulled elsewhere and pushed elsewhere. And so this is the one which probably is the most substantial time commitment from the things we've talked about so far. And so I think it has to be accounted for in the books, because this is a function as time goes and as the business grows, you want to gradually replace parts of that role so that your focus narrows over time. Whilst it narrows, it can go deep. As we grow in the number of GPs, then GP retention becomes much more, if that's one of your functions, becomes a much deeper function you have to focus on. Well, if you are still trying to do 7 or 10 other things and consult, maybe that's a bit harder. And so then it becomes harder to grow because it's hard to outgrow your leaky bucket. And so I think for me, this is the one that really, if you're going to start anywhere, this and those extra hats of the technician, whether you're a supervisor or teacher, these two sets of hats are the ones that I would be saying you need to really find out and work out mechanisms with your co-owners around accounting for the time commitment for this. Number one, so you can budget the time, but number two, you can budget the money, because at some point, as you grow and develop your business, you would hopefully be able to invest in other humans to do some of that work so that you can either have a bit more time for you or go deeper in some field of endeavor in your executive function that you want to.
Yeah, 100%. I think a lot of this time is, when you're looking at Eisenhower matrix, it's in that top right quadrant where it's important work but not urgent work. And so if it's ignored, what happens is the runway of the practice will be shortened. You won't have the same good outcomes. And you don't usually have flexibility with this time. If you're going to lead the team, you got to do it in work hours. You can't do that stuff between 7 p.m. and 8 p.m. at night, which may be a good thing, but you can't do it after hours or kind of cobble together a solution outside of your consulting. As you rightly said, it often requires some sacrifice of your consulting capacity to do it. And therefore, it can kind of fall to the most altruistic owner sometimes, somebody who just identifies that it needs to be done. It's frustrating it's not being done. I'll step into that. And then the other thing that's part of this is whom to attribute this to, but a wise person I heard said you can't grow into pain. You cannot expand something that is painful to you. And so therefore, you kind of end up stuck there with somebody who's unwillingly doing a small amount of this, not as much as they should be doing. They're not being remunerated for it. And meanwhile, the other doctors are ripping off and going and doing other consulting. And so when I say ripping off, I mean, they're not contributing. They're going to do the things that they want to do. That does personally reward them. And so you end up in this circumstance where you can really be trading off your future for just your capacity to earn as an individual But that means that you're sacrificing the business growth. That's the big deal that we don't want to be doing in any business.
Absolutely. And when I think to some of the worst moments in ownership that I've had, they've come when I've been stretched in this role.
Yep.
So typically, maybe you got outside work commitments. I had at the time young family, baby at home, trying to squeeze in. I remember distinctly we had our management meetings, but also the manager would come and talk to us between patients sometimes about
Right.
situations, and that rapid switching of hats is number one stressful, most likely not to catch you on your best day and best moment because you're going to be a bit frazzled. And in this situation, that whole relationship with that manager turned to custard because just was not set up for success, and I was stressing myself out, and the subsequent fallout from that was actually quite painful and led to a lot of sleepless nights as an owner. HR stuff, especially early in your ownership career, certainly for me, and I think still we're GPs at heart, we're kind, and so when then HR problems arise because of whatever situation, it's very painful. But actually in the situation, if I reflect on that decade and a half ago, whenever it was really just not set up for success structurally with these hats, and so it's bound to fail. And I wouldn't have known that. I wouldn't have even thought of that.
Yeah, ultimately that's it, right? You just need to set yourself up to win more likely than fail. And you just kind of work your way through these. I think sometimes being high capacity individuals, as GPs often are, and you've learnt from a young age that there's a linear relationship between outcomes and work. So you just think, I'll just work a bit harder and I'll get a better outcome. Unfortunately, that's completely false. And there are plenty of people that achieve good outcomes and don't put in hard work. You can't escape the fact that you do have to work hard, especially if you're starting a business, but you want to be working hard on the right things and making sure that you are getting the right amount of leverage. So I think that's really critical to that. Thanks for sharing that story, Sachin. The last one I've got on my list is the creator, and this is more project-based, but the types of things that come up, there's a whole bunch of best practice templates that need to be worked out, or the federal government decides to go and change the way that they remunerate MBS for CDM, for example, or some other big change that requires a rebuild of what you already have. And these come about semi-regularly, and sometimes it can be a decent amount of project work, right? It might be 1, 2, 4 weeks of fairly sustained effort that just needs to go into creating and building something new or rebuilding something that's broken. Talk a bit about your experience around the creator role and how you see that.
Yeah, so I think typically as an owner, I'll speak for myself now, but I'm sure there'll be people who identify with this. You have a real drive to want to make things better, just improve, make things more efficient, more effective, make it a better outcome for the patient, make it a better outcome for the fellow doctors in your practice, the other doctors, the whole team. And entrepreneurs and business people tend, not all, but in my experience, tend to have some, I don't think it's pathological because I don't like that word because it's actually really useful, but they have this optimism that is unrestrained optimism.
Unchecked.
Yeah, unchecked. And that's really powerful. It helps you, drives you forward, and you see improvements that others can't see.
Yep.
And because you can see opportunities to improve things that other people can't see, and often the people around you will be busy and head down, bum up, and you want those improvements to come around fast, then we often will take it upon ourselves, roll up the sleeves and just build whatever needs to be built. Right? And so I was almost having flashbacks when you're talking about building best practice templates or whatever, but that's literally what you'll do. If you know it can be smoother, better, easier, faster, cleaner, save time and energy for other people. We've all done it. We've done it, right? Because number one, because you just want it done. But number two, no one else knows how to do it, right? And so strangely here, you get into this situation where you can be creating at different levels, but sometimes the ideal level of creativity is the mental creativity. And the ability to articulate that very clearly to those around you so they can see it in the same way you can see it, but then can be your help and hands to actually help bring it about. And we've seen Project X, some of the people who've done so fantastically well, it's when they've been able to raise their creator layer from the actual hands-on doing to the seeing and then the articulating clearly of what they want to create. But in this area, I think the areas you can come a cropper are sometimes you're just so bloody busy that finding headspace to be creative is just a luxury. Or you can be in these situations in business partnerships where there's perhaps a lack of alignment. And so even though you want to create, you feel shackled by those around you.
Yeah.
And we've certainly seen both of those. And so probably if you're in the first group where you're just so busy that you want to, you've got a burning desire to make things better, but the only way you can fit in at the moment is around your work. Well, time isn't going to make itself, right? It has to start with putting some time aside and then focusing on just one thing you're going to do with that time to make an improvement and then building upon that. If you're with business partners who it feels like are shackling you, then I think it's really important to have some really honest conversations and get some alignment, because it speaks to a lack of alignment around the business or around roles, and that's okay. It's healthy to have disagreements. What shouldn't happen is to let that disagreement fester and become something unhealthy. And so sometimes first I would start with the conversation, but then you may need to bring in an external facilitator to help sort of tease out the alignment or lack of alignment, because it may mean ultimately that it's not a place that each owner can achieve what they want to achieve. But there's a third option where the other owners in that situation just get out of the way and say to that person with the creative energy, they delegate authority within a framework and trust that person to run with the ball. And certainly, one of our favourite stories that we've got is someone who did just that in South Australia, right? Took permission from fellow owners, could see things could be better, could see a better path, and then was able to have that difficult conversation over time, and then was able to drive that practice forward really, and created something quite spectacular from what seemed like inauspicious beginnings, but it had all the ingredients for success, and it was just because of the courage of that conversation. But that creator hat is also the other one that needs to be remunerated and recognised. Even, again, if it's not directly paid, depending on the situation, the money needs to be accounted for that time, because there's very few people who can do that creator role at that layer, and that's normally going to be an owner shareholder. Sometimes you'll have non-owners who have ownership tendencies in terms of their behaviours and the values, but typically that's an owner and someone who's really driven just to make things better. They're not even driven by financial means or financial results. They're often just driven by, I want to make things better for more people. Let me make it better because I don't like it being crap.
Yeah, and I think if you were to pay someone external, it'd be a fairly highly paid consultant on an hourly rate. And so that type of work is really deep strategic work, so isn't inexpensive. And really the goal with these 5 hats, as you alluded to earlier, Sachin, is the purpose of improving the business is to be able to acknowledge and reward these roles individually, because if you don't do that, you're going to have a business that is hamstrung and cannot perform at the highest level because it's missing the key ingredients and it just relies too much on altruism and goodwill. And whilst that's a reasonable fuel for the work that we do, it isn't necessarily a renewable energy source. And so we shouldn't be taking for granted people's contribution in those areas. We want to make sure there's the financial capacity in the business to reward that. Thanks. I think that brings us to the end of this session. We look forward to seeing you in the next one. Bye.
Bye for me. Thanks for tuning in to the Scale My Clinic podcast. I hope today's episode gave you valuable insights and practical steps to take your clinic to the next level. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And don't forget to share it with other general practice owners who'd benefit from improving their practices too. Looking for more tools, resources and updates? Why not follow us on Facebook at Scale My Clinic to stay connected, to join the conversation with like-minded practice owners. Let's keep working together to scale your clinic and build something truly impactful. See you next time.